All right. Hi, y'all. Thanks so much for joining us today for our webinar, Data Center Impacts in Arizona, Policy Solutions for Water and Energy Use. Our presenters today are myself and my colleague, Dr. Alex Ruthier. I am a Clean Energy Policy Advisor at Western Resource Advocates, and Alex is the Arizona Clean Energy Manager and Senior Policy Advisor. So a few housekeeping things before we get started. You can use the Q&A function to ask questions throughout the webinar. This webinar is also being recorded, and the recording will be sent to the email that you registered with. So today we're going to talk about why WRA is working on this topic. We'll discuss the water and power impacts of data centers, some suggestions for navigating those water and power demands, and then I'll turn it over to Alex, who will describe how this topic is being played out at various utilities in the state, as well as at the Arizona Corporation Commission. And then we'll go over some policy solutions to the energy and water concerns brought up, including policies and legislation from other states. And then at the end, we will have plenty of time for questions. So as you can see in the image on the right, WRA published a report on data centers earlier this summer. And the reason that we published that report is that we were seeing in our utilities that data centers were driving huge increases in future electricity demand. And of course, electricity demand requires a way to generate that electricity, whether that be zero carbon or fossil resources. So we wanted to put out a report that quantified the future growth in expected electricity in our region on a utility by utility basis, and also talk about how the way we meet that demand is hugely consequential for both ratepayers as well as for greenhouse gas emissions, and to look into some policy solutions. And we also looked into the water impacts of data center, both direct on-site use, as well as the water that may be needed for additional electricity generation resources. And so that report that we published is really intended to be a resource for decision makers and anyone who wants a better grasp of the intersection of water and energy issues and data centers in Western states. And I'll just say that this is especially pertinent for Arizonans, given that the Phoenix metro area is the fourth largest data center market in the US after Northern Virginia, Atlanta, and Dallas. And based on various projections I've seen, it's either the first or second fastest growing market in the US for data centers. So the on-site water use for data centers is calculated by using the national average on-site water intensity of data centers. And so that's this dark green estimated incremental water use that's just from the cooling of data centers. And then that is very reliant on national data, but we've seen that individual data centers' water use can vary greatly. So for example, a dry-cooled data center had a water use efficiency of 0.11 liters per kilowatt hour, whereas a hybrid wet-dry cooled data center had a water use efficiency of 6.47 liters per kilowatt hour. So that's a huge range that's presented there. And the projections that WRA has in that orange bar about the potential additional water demand associated with gas generation assumes that all the incremental additional utility electricity demand will be met with combined cycle gas plants, which are rather water intensive. So looking at the water and electricity use of data centers in Arizona, you can see that there is significant growth among the three major utilities of Salt River Project, Arizona Public Service, and Tucson Electric Power. In just the last 2 to 3 years, the previously forecasted amount of demand that these utilities have projected has shot up. And so what we have here in these pullout graphics are snapshots from regulatory filings, which are kind of a piece of what we were able to pull for our report, but that's not reflective of necessarily today's conditions, which are actually seeing those projected demands look even higher. I will also note on the water piece here that Ceres recently put out a fantastic report that's called Drained by Data that focused specifically on the Phoenix region as a case study and found that the water use associated with data center cooling operations in the region is expected to increase by 870% as more facilities come online, going from just under 400 million gallons a year to more than 3.7 billion gallons annually over the next 6 years. And that analysis is really interesting because it also mapped the current and planned data centers to their respective utility, whether that be APS or SRP, to understand the power mix and the power generation water withdrawal intensities of their current generation mix, assuming that mix were to be stable and continue. And so if all 124 planned data centers in the Phoenix region were to come online under that methodology, the indirect water use would increase by almost 400% from an estimated 2.9 billion gallons annually to nearly 14.5 billion gallons annually. And to put that in context, 14.5 billion gallons is enough to supply the entire city of Scottsdale for over 2 years. So now we'll briefly touch on why we're talking about water and energy in this webinar in such an intertwined way and why they have this nexus when it comes to data centers. And the reason for that is cooling technology. So data centers use an average of 40% of their electricity for cooling, but there are trade-offs between using water and electricity for data center cooling. So to understand those trade-offs, I'm going to give a brief overview of cooling technologies. So on the far left, we have refrigeration cooling, which is circulating cool air through the data center and removing hot air. And the way that hot air is cooled can be either through a compressor unit with air or through a water-cooled chiller. And using a water-cooled chiller for refrigeration cooling is generally the most water-intensive type of cooling that a data center can employ. We also have direct evaporative cooling, which is using water to cool the air circulated in the data center. It works similarly to a swamp cooler would in your house, and so it's most effective in arid climates without a lot of humidity. And an important thing to note there is that some amount of water is being evaporated in that process, and so that's inherently a water consumptive cooling process, and generally more than half the water is evaporated out in these direct evaporative cooling systems. We also have free cooling, which utilizes natural features like cold outdoor air when it's available to help cool the data center. And so that's generally used in tandem with another system as opposed to being a primary cooling method. And then lastly, liquid cooling is a system which uses liquid to directly cool computing equipment itself, as opposed to cooling the air around the computing equipment. And liquid cooling can use either water or a specialized coolant liquid for that purpose. So the way to kind of compare across all of these different water usage metrics is something called WUE, water use efficiency. This is measured on a liters of water per kilowatt hour basis, so higher numbers reflect lower efficiency. In 2023, the average WUE for data centers was 0.36 liters per kilowatt hour, and hyperscalers had significantly higher WUE scores at 1.22 liters per kilowatt hour. So again, seeing that there is a significant range in terms of the water use effectiveness scores. And so what all of that really means is that there is no one clear best available option for cooling technology for every single data center scenario. And it's really dependent on factors like climate, water availability, and the generation mix of grid electricity in terms of both the emissions of that grid electricity and also the indirect water use there. So it's a complicated question that will vary based on the specific situation. But now I'll talk a little bit more about some of the foundational policies that can be used to navigate water demands. The first of which is consistent and transparent water use reporting. So right now, there's unfortunately little publicly available information on water use from current data centers and water use from expected data centers. There's also tension over whether and when water use projections from new data centers should be made publicly available, with data center developers and local governments sometimes entering into NDAs about that information. So all this illustrates that there's a clear gap in information collection and availability. And so to guide future decision making, we really believe that it's important to have data on an annual basis that includes total water use efficiency, as well as peak use from data centers, since cooling needs can require more water in the summer when water resources are already at their most strained. The second bucket of foundational policies is technical best management practices for on-site water management. So again, there isn't necessarily a blanket policy recommendation that we'll make here, but we will note that certain local jurisdictions have established guidelines based on circumstances that are specific to their geography and water considerations. So for instance, Southern Nevada Water Authority in the Las Vegas metro area has an outright ban on evaporative cooling for commercial and industrial uses. So that's an example of that on-site water management. Another example is in Marana, Arizona, which does not allow for the provision of potable water specifically to a data center for cooling or humidity control purposes. So some considerations that jurisdictions can look at in establishing these best management practices are the water source, whether that's recycled or if there's only potable supply that's available on the system, efficient design for airflow of the data center structure to minimize the need for water usage, as well as closed loop systems that eliminate evaporative loss, and of course, the type of cooling technology that is employed and restrictions on that. So large water user policies are what they sound like. They're policies that are applicable to users of certain amounts, generally established volumetrically, of water. And we've seen municipalities like Tucson, Arizona, have created large water user policies that apply to users with water demands over a certain amount. So in Tucson, those folks that meet that threshold have to submit an application that includes information on how they will reduce their water consumption, as well as showing they can meet the requirement to use recycled water to offset at least 30% of water use. And that can either be through connection to the reclaimed water system and or on-site reuse. They also have to demonstrate consistency with the water master plan and the city's available water resources, as well as provide proof that there is sufficient economic benefit to warrant the large use of water, among other application items. And that application is then considered by both the Tucson mayor and city council. So the project is receiving additional scrutiny in line with the fact that it is a large water use application. That ordinance passed in Tucson in late August and was developed as a response to the Project Blue data center that was also proposed in Tucson. Another example of this is in Tempe, where an ordinance classifies certain data centers as extreme water users. And that extreme water use designation requires the submission of a water use plan to the City Public Works Department prior to a building permit being issued for the facility. And another example of this is over in Colorado. The city of Aurora simply does not allow for new users to exceed certain volumetric and non-recoverable water use thresholds. And so an application that was over those thresholds would have to work with the city to find a way to increase their recoverable water use to be in line with that or lower their volumetric demands. So that's an overview of some of the foundational policies for navigating water demands, and I will pass it over to my colleague, Alex.
Thanks, Deb. Hi, everybody. As Deb mentioned, my name's Alex Ruthier. I am the the Clean Energy Manager and Senior Policy Advisor for Western Resource Advocates here in Arizona. I work out of our Phoenix office. Today, I'm coming to you from Tucson, and I was at a meeting at TEP, and they graciously gave me a conference room to be able to call into this meeting today. So thank you to TEP for that. So some of the issues with building these new data centers are cost shifting issues. And so I'm going to go through a few examples of how things are rolling out in Arizona and the way that we're thinking about some of these things. And so the first one that we're going to talk about is how SRP has set up minimum billing for their large customers. And for those who don't know, SRP works a little bit differently than most of the other utilities in Arizona. They're not regulated by the Arizona Corporation Commission. Instead, they're regulated by an elected board of directors. And SRP doesn't hold rate cases at the Corporation Commission because they're not regulated there. They use a separate process, which is called a pricing process, which they most recently completed one earlier this year. And they use that process to make updates to cost allocation, rates, and other customer costs and pricing related items. In this most recent pricing process, SRP management advocated for changes to their E67 plan, as you can see there on the slide. And that E67 plan is for loads that are over 20 megawatts. 20 megawatts is a very large load. So a 20 megawatt load for 1 hour would give you 20 megawatt hours. And that's enough power to serve about 6,000 average US homes for an entire day. So we're talking about a substantial amount of power that these entities are consuming. In management's proposal, they stated that SRP expects significant load growth driven by various very large load customers in an effort to shield other customers from being required to pay for costs incurred to serve customers' load that may not materialize. Management proposes modifications to the E67 price plan to ensure that SRP recovers the costs incurred to provide the customer requested capacity. So that's a long-winded way of saying that SRP management wants to make sure that other customers are not paying if these large load customers are not coming through with the forecasts and projections that they're coming forward with. And so this minimum demand charge would be the greater of their actual demand or 80% of their forecasted load. So it's all loads over 20 megawatts. So for a 20 megawatt load, if they come online and they're doing what they said they were going to do, they're consuming high load factor around 20 megawatts, then their demand charge would be 20 megawatts. If for some reason they're not meeting that number that they forecasted, say they're only consuming at their peak 10 megawatts, SRP would still charge them for 16 megawatts as their peak demand, because that's 80% of the 20 megawatts. And so it's helping to protect existing customers for having to make up the difference for what the company is forecasting. This is how much electricity we're going to buy, and SRP going out, acquiring either new resources on their system, building new power plants, or purchasing power through a purchase power agreement, through some type of market agreement, a bilateral contract, and then the data center not using all that power, somebody still has to pay for those resources and that power acquisition. And so this is helping to make sure that it's the data center that still continues to pay for that, even if they're not the one using the power, and that cost doesn't get shifted onto SRP's other customers. I think this is I'll say the board did agree in the pricing process with SRP management, and they did make these changes to the price plan. So this is, I believe it becomes effective in November of this year, according to that vote. And I think this is a great first step that SRP is really forward thinking here. And it's helping to shield ratepayers from those large loads. If the data centers are not consuming as much as they said they were going to. There's still some more that needs to be done here. It doesn't consider issues like what happens if this data center goes bankrupt and they're no longer consuming any power, but they also are not able to pay that minimum demand charge. And so some additional steps to take, but like I said, I think this is a great first step by SRP and a best practice here in Arizona. We'll talk about APS as well. APS has filed a rate case at the Corporation Commission. They filed that back in June. And the hearing for their rate case will be heard beginning next May, at the end of next May. So They talk a lot about extra high load factor customers. XHLF is the abbreviation for extra high load factor customers. These are customers, I kind of described this when I was talking about SRP, but customers that have a constant load throughout the day that is very close to what their maximum possible load is. So from the prior example, if they're able to consume 20 megawatts, they're likely consuming very close to 20 megawatts through most hours of the day, of the week, of the month, which means that means they have a high load factor. Data centers tend to be these extra high load factor customers, and it's very different than the way a residential customer or small business would typically consume power. I think a lot of us have heard of the duck curve before and concerns about the duck curve and what that looks like. And these types of extra high load factor customers do not fit that trend of exacerbating the duck curve that we've heard about for so long. If we graphed it over time, their consumption would really just look like a flat line across the graph. In APS's testimony in their upcoming rate case, they are advocating for, as they call it, growth pay for growth, and they project to build and serve data center loads are not subject to the typical cost allocation and are wholly attributed to extra high load factor customers. So if a new data center is coming online and they're saying we are going to consume 50 megawatts, and AEPS goes out and builds a 50 megawatt plant, was a little bit of oversimplification, but they go out and build a 50 megawatt plant to specifically serve this load. When APS does their cost allocation as part of a rate case, they will not attribute any of those costs to their existing customers, to the other customers. They'll maintain that cost for that new plant to serve that data center is attributed to that data center and paid for by that data center. And this again helps to insulate other ratepayers from these rising, potentially large costs due to these new data center loads. And I will say that this is still an active case. Like I said, the hearing doesn't start until next May. So this is a proposal that's still under evaluation at the ACC. And the final ACC decision may change significantly from what APS has proposed. But it does show that APS recognizes the disparity and potential bill impact for other ratepayers that could come from this influx of extra high load factor customers. And the last thing that I just wanted to point out is the Corporation Commission, who regulates utilities in Arizona, primarily Arizona Public Service and Tucson Electric Power, but as well as many other small utilities in Arizona. Chairman Thompson, the chairman of the Arizona Corporation Commission, opened a docket earlier this year in April, specifically for data center related issues. I've listed the docket number there if you're interested. And from his letter, as you can see there, it is important to balance the economic opportunities presented by data centers with the need to financially protect other ratepayers to ensure they are not bearing the rising energy generation and transmission costs associated with this burgeoning industry. And I think in Commissioner Thompson's letter, he does a really good job of thinking about the balance of economic development and also protecting existing customers, and who pays for this new build out. I think that there's a good understanding that a lot of this load growth is speculative in nature and it carries substantial risk. And so really thinking through that in a meaningful way. There have been, the last time I checked a couple days ago, there's about 20 stakeholders who had filed comments in this docket for recommendations. I'm hoping that Chairman Thompson is going to have a workshop on data centers in the future. Yep. And yeah, I think it's back to Deb. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex, for that insight on Arizona utilities. So I'm going to talk a bit about some of WRA's recommended policy solutions to address the water and energy impacts from data centers. So I'll start on the energy side with clean transition tariffs. And what a clean transition tariff is an offering, a rate offering from a utility that large customers, including data centers, can opt into. It's a voluntary tariff, and it allows for the utility to go out and procure a clean resource specifically for that large customer, even if that clean resource is more expensive than what would be procured in the utility's regular resource procurement process. And so it really kind of puts clean energy explicitly on the menu and allows for those customers to work with the utility to procure a resource that can serve their load and to ensure that they are paying that incremental cost of that resource's electricity and for the cost of bringing that resource online specifically to serve them. And so that's something that really allows the corporate sustainability goals of some of these large customers to be explicitly put into practice in the utility setting in terms of the resources that are serving them. An example of this clean transition tariff concept is currently being played out in Nevada, where NV Energy has a clean transition tariff. And one of their customers, Google, has worked with them through that clean transition tariff to procure a geothermal plant that will be coming online in the early 2030s to serve specifically a data center's load. So we really like that policy as one that can help these companies that are really interested in clean energy have an avenue to work directly with their utility to procure that. Additionally, behind the meter clean resource deployment is allowing for these large customers to deploy renewables as well as batteries to pair with those renewables on the customer side of the meter. And so it may be necessary to develop additional tariffs, so rates and rate structures that allow for that to occur so that the utility is meeting some of the customer's load, but some of the customer's load is served with resources on their side of the meter. And I also just want to note that in developing any sort of program for behind the meter clean resource deployment, it's really important that the customer that has those resources is still appropriately compensating the utility for all of the grid services that they receive from being interconnected with the utility. And we really want to make sure when looking at those sort of programs that those costs are appropriately captured so that other ratepayers are not bearing those costs. Another policy we're really excited about is load shifting, which is essentially programs that allow for the data center or large customers' electricity usage to be reduced at times of peak grid demand and any sort of grid stress events. And so there are a lot of different ways to get that load shifting. Traditionally, there's been these sort of demand response programs that are incentive programs where, say, you have a thermostat that's enrolled in a demand response program, you might get a ping from your utility that there's an event, and you could maybe turn your thermostat up a couple of degrees to use less air conditioning to participate in that event. For these data center customers, there's that analog of traditional demand response, but there's also something that's called a flexible interconnection tariff, where essentially the customer is agreeing as a condition of coming onto the grid and being served by the utility that they are amenable to having their load reduced by a certain percentage or megawatt threshold, a certain amount of the time. And that's something that can be really valuable in helping these customers actually come online earlier, because if they are willing to not exacerbate those peaks during certain times, then it's possible the utility might not have to build out peaking infrastructure to be able to meet that or require additional resources to meet their reserve margin requirements. And so that's a really powerful tool. But again, that's something where the utility needs to be able to offer that to the customer. So it really needs to be proactively pursued by the utility. Energy efficiency is another one where it's possible to have regulations that require data centers to meet certain energy efficiency benchmarks. There's an old saying that the cleanest megawatt hour of electricity is the megawatt hour of electricity that you don't have to use. And so meeting certain benchmarking around like airflow as well as site design can be a really powerful incentive, and that can include things like ensuring there is some sort of plan for free cooling to utilize that free resource of cool air when it is available naturally outside. And then shifting more into consumer protections that WRA also finds to be very important, because we really want to ensure that electricity remains affordable for all consumers and that no cost shifting is occurring from these large customers. One of the really belt and suspenders policies there is contract provisions. Contracts are never all that fun to talk about, but they're really important. Some of the pieces of contract provisions that can ensure that the costs incurred by serving these new customers are actually borne by them include minimum contract lengths, as well as reduction or termination of service charges. So that essentially means that even if a data center were taking service, if they decided they were closing up shop or significantly reducing the amount of load that they had initially requested from the utility, there would be some sort of financial skin in the game for them. So the utility would be able to recoup some or all of the investment that was made based on those premises. And then another really important contract provision can be minimum billing demand. So that essentially ensures that the data center's bill is going to meet a certain floor so that the utility has certainty about recovering an amount of revenue from that customer through their monthly bill. And then going hand in hand with this, a more general category is rate making and EDR, or economic development rate reform. So rate making encompasses a lot of things, but I will get into rate classes and cost allocation. Rate classes are essentially the groups that a utility looks at in determining how to divvy up the different costs that the utility incurs over the entire system. And so we've seen certain states put really large customers and data centers into their own rate class, like Alex mentioned. And that can be a really good way to kind of isolate those customers that have these really unique characteristics and be more able to properly assess and then assign the cost that those customers are incurring to ensure that other commercial customers are not lumped in together with those, and that there are specific rate structures that are available to those customers with specific characteristics like data centers. And then economic development rate reform is looking at kind of what the existing economic development rates are. And so an economic development rate generally offers a discounted rate of electricity, and that tends to be based on the metric of what are the total megawatts of demand of a customer. And if they exceed this threshold, they might be able to receive an economic development rate. And the premise there generally was that really large electric customers were likely spurring a lot of economic development and job growth. When you think about advanced manufacturing or even traditional manufacturing, like a factory moving into town, that might be something where it makes sense to have an economic development rate for the co-benefits of the job creation to that community. That generally does not hold true for data centers. There's a decent amount of construction jobs that are supported throughout their construction, which can even take many years. But once they are fully built, they don't tend to support significant amounts of permanent full-time jobs. And so reassessing what the goals of economic development rates are and seeing if there are revisions to those rates and who can qualify for those rates to bring the goals of that rate, and then who is actually taking service on that rate in line with each other. And then on the water side, water efficiency and reporting, as I mentioned, water reporting is really a foundational policy that in a lot of ways is absent for these data centers. And then based on that, and this can be at the local level, having water efficiency requirements, as well as other requirements around like recoverability or limits on use of potable or otherwise scarce water resources can be something that can really mitigate the use of water from these data centers in an environment where it's scarce. Okay, so now I'm gonna move from talking about kind of broad policy recommendations into legislation that other states have passed to address this. all three pieces of legislation that I'll talk about from Minnesota, Texas, and Oregon passed in the 2025 session, which saw a proliferation of data center related bills across the country. And I'm going to specifically talk about these three states because I think they represent a really interesting range of different policy actions that state legislators took to address this issue. So in Minnesota, this bill passed in a special session in 2025. And I will also note that the definition for data centers here applies to data centers that have 100 megawatts or more of load. So these are extremely large customers that Minnesota has chosen to have this legislation applied to. So on the water use side, for any of these 100 megawatt or more customers that also anticipate using over 100 million gallons per year, there are additional requirements they have to go through prior to the issuance of a permit for that facility. So Minnesota is allowed to evaluate the project based on a number of criteria, including whether the technologies or measures promote water conservation, the efficient use of water and watershed health, and they're allowed to consider various factors, including, but not limited to, using water efficient fixtures and practices, recycling water before discharging, partnering with local water utilities to use discharged water from the data center, using reclaimed water, installing closed loop systems, and supporting water restoration and replenishment in local watersheds. So this really gives a broad range of considerations that are allowable in looking at permitting decisions. And it also allows for aquifer tests to be required before the issuance of a permit to look at the health of local water resources. In terms of the energy and consumer protection side, the Minnesota legislation creates a new large customer class and specifically assigns the Public Utilities Commission in Minnesota to establish a definition and the appropriate characteristics of that very large customer class, and as well as establish subclasses if it deems appropriate. And so after that large customer class definition is created, which is required to be done by December of 2026, it also creates a system where the criteria for approval for tariffs or electric service agreements for those large customers is based on a number of factors laid out in the bill. And so some of those factors are that the electricity provided by the utility has to achieve the quantitative benchmarks that are in the state statute regarding greenhouse gas emissions reductions for public utilities. And that has to be demonstrated by the utility submitting a plan that shows that it can serve that additional load without requesting a delay or modification to those statutory standards for greenhouse gas emissions reductions. The rates also have to contain provisions and protections that are necessary to ensure that other classes of the public utility are not placed at risk for paying stranded asset costs associated with the utility serving that customer. And then there's also a requirement that those clean energy and capacity tariffs be filed from all public utilities. So all of those public utilities have to come up with clean energy tariffs specifically for ensuring that they can meet that requirement for data centers to be served with clean energy and submit that to the Public Utilities Commission for approval. And then lastly, there is this requirement in the bill that data centers have to meet a set of sustainable design or green building standards for the structures themselves. And I also just wanted to highlight this quote from a Minnesota legislator that says, data centers will use less electricity in Minnesota because Minnesota is colder. That's why so many would like to put them here. I think that's a pretty stark contrast to the climate in Arizona, where it's obviously arid and very hot, and yet Arizona is a data center hotspot. And so what we're really seeing across the country is that so many different markets are emerging for data centers, and it seems like there's kind of a rationale for putting data centers everywhere that they're putting data centers. So next I'm going to talk about Texas SB 6, which was a bill that was passed by a supermajority and then signed by the governor. And I'll note that the definition for large loads in this bill is 75 megawatts and above, so significantly lower than the Minnesota definition. And so this bill does a couple of things. It has a rulemaking component that requires a rulemaking to ensure that these large customers are paying their interconnection costs, so paying the cost to get connected to the grid. And going along with that, there's a financial commitment mechanism that's required for these customers to pay into before transmission to serve them can be built. There's also a methodology for demonstrating site control. So that really outlines kind of some principles of how data centers can show that they actually are going to show up. And that's helpful for the utilities planning process and serving them. But I think the most noteworthy thing about this bill here is that there's this requirement for the use of backup generation for load curtailment. So what that means is that these large customers, if they have on-site backup generation that is capable of serving at least 50% of their on-site electricity demand, then by this law, they are required during grid emergencies to be able to deploy that backup generation to reduce their load. And so the grid operator in Texas is able, under this law going forward, to call upon these really large customers that have backup generation to use that backup generation in case of grid emergencies. And so this is a very interesting approach to kind of leveraging the existing backup generation to potentially reduce times of grid peak demand in emergencies. So moving on to Oregon, I'll first note that this bill has a significantly lower threshold for the data centers that are considered under this bill, which is 20 megawatts, which is much, much lower than that 100 and even that 75 megawatt. But as Alex explained in some of the previous slides, is still an extremely large customer. And this bill in Oregon does a couple of things. So first, it requires the Public Utilities Commission there to consider whether rate structures for data centers impede the state's statutory clean energy goals for electricity from public utilities, as well as whether the costs of serving the class are represented and mitigate the risks of other classes having increased costs. So it's not just, is this class recovering its actual cost, but are we also ensuring that there isn't increased risk for other customer classes? And a key element of that is that the bill explicitly states that there needs to be a different class of service for data centers from other industrial and commercial classes because they have these unique characteristics as well as increased risk profiles that are not necessarily associated with other types of industrial and commercial customers. And it's also very interesting that this legislation in Oregon really gets into some of kind of the nitty-gritty of utility regulation, and that it requires for this new customer class of data centers over 20 megawatts that they enter into contracts with a 10-year minimum term. And then also it specifies that there needs to be some sort of obligation requiring the customer in those contracts to pay a minimum amount or percentage based on their projected electricity usage when they initially sign that contract, but it does leave the details of that minimum to be established by the Public Utilities Commission. So there's kind of this blend of the legislature saying, we know that the contract term needs to be a 10-year minimum, but we will leave the Public Utilities Commission to figure out the appropriate details for that minimum payment amount on that contract. So this again is a really interesting example of how a state is looking at data centers and kind of deciding to legislate to protect consumers and then also to protect existing statutory goals around clean energy in the electricity sector. So hopefully that gives you all watching a good overview of what some other states are doing and WRA's recommended solutions, as well as kind of an overview of how data centers are impacting water and energy use in Arizona. And that's all the content that we have to you. So we will open it up to questions. So the first question is, are these data centers providing a net benefit in terms of economic development and new jobs beyond construction? Um, so I can take a shot at answering this one. So in terms of economic development, there are contributions to property tax revenues that are specifically significant on like the local level from these data centers. But in terms of long-term jobs, generally these data centers are not supporting more than like 50 to 100 employees. And oftentimes what we see is that that's not pulling from the local workforce, but rather they bring in folks from elsewhere to fill those positions. So there can be economic benefits, but they're mostly in the form of tax revenue as opposed to job creation. But I will note that the construction jobs can be very significant, and these can be multi-year projects to construct these data centers. And then there's another question. Is the BUG in this case the same as islanding? I'm going to assume that's referring to the Texas legislation, and I'm going to assume that BUG is backup generation. So the BUG in this case is not the same as islanding. What it means is actually that they're not islanded, but they are reducing their load significantly. And so it's just like kind of a forced DR program. Alex, do you want to take the question about the TPT tax exemptions?
I can try to talk to some of it. Are we aware that there are tax exemptions for data center equipment in Arizona? Yes, there are some tax exemptions. I don't know the full scale of all of them. I know there are a number of them in Arizona. As far as the question, aren't we past the time where we need to attract them to Arizona? I think this group can be the judge of that. I think in my opinion, in my personal opinion, I think we are past that time. But I know there are others in the state of Arizona, the Chamber of Commerce, and some other who'd like to continue attracting these types of data centers here. However, as Deb just mentioned, there is not a huge payoff in the form of jobs, particularly not in local jobs, and so there is definitely concern with continuing to attract these types of projects to Arizona. Hopefully that answered the question.
Okay, great. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Feel free to pop them in the Q&A. And I'm seeing one that just came in. Believe that SRP's policies disproportionately impact the residential class. More of a reason to elect pro-clean energy board members. Don't know if that's necessarily a question, but Alex, would you like to speak to any of the impacts of SRP's policies on the residential class and whether or not that's a disproportionate impact there?
Sorry, I was having trouble unmuting there. I want to be careful here because I we are a C3 organization, and I don't want to talk about elections at all here. And so I'll just say that I'm not going to advocate for any type of election related items here. As far as disproportionately affecting residential customers, I think that's yet to be seen. The board voted on this policy, like I said, back earlier this year. I believe it was the end of February or beginning of March when that vote happened. These policies go into effect in November of this year. And so I think there may be some potential for that. I hope that the SRP board stays on top of this and keeps a close eye on the things that are happening and best practices around the country. But I think, like I said during my portion of the presentation, I think this is a great first step in recognizing that existing customers, not just residential customers, small businesses and other existing customers that are already connected to the grid are protected from this new load growth and the potential costs that could come from that. So I'll say kudos to SRP for taking this first step. I think it was they did that with some foresight, knowing that this was on the horizon, and hopefully they continue to look forward and make those changes as appropriate.